Do you feel that when you spend time with other people, you take on their energy? Or that when you finish a therapy session with your patients, you take on theirs? If so, today you are going to discover why this happens and how to make it stop happening to you. As you can see here on screen, there are 5 different reasons why you may take on other people's energy, whether you are interacting with them on the street, at home, or inside your practice. The first is the way we relate to those people. Depending on the type of energetic interactions that take place, we will or will not absorb that person's energy. Now we're going to go deeper into this point. Then there are unhealed internal blocks. Let me briefly summarize this for you. Basically, our energy field contains all the energy from all the emotions, thoughts, and burdens in general that we have accumulated throughout our lives. Therefore, when those burdens have not been healed, we tend to come into contact with people who are suffering from a similar block, and that block resonates with us. And it's not that we absorb it, but rather that it activates our own internal block. And obviously through resonance, let's say that it makes it a little worse. Let's move on to point number 3, which is the internal state we are in when we interact with that person or when we interact with our patient. This is very important. If we are very frustrated during a conversation or during a therapy session, if we are feeling bad, if we feel that we are forcing ourselves to do it, that weakens our energy, especially if we are not being genuine. In other words, let me give you an example. When we pretend and don't actually want to be with someone, we put ourselves into a negative internal attitude. This makes us much more likely to become energetically contaminated if we are not truly being genuine. Then, on the other hand, if you practice energy therapy, there is something very important, which is energetic hygiene techniques. In these types of situations, because you are directly interacting with the person's energy, it is extremely important to apply them, but this would only be relevant if you actually practice energy therapy or if you want to learn how to practice it. And finally, subsequent energetic connections. As we have been discussing so far, there are these 5 points, and the first one is the way we relate to the other person. Ultimately, each of our chakras interacts with the other person's chakras when we connect with them. For example, in a relationship where there is a lot of love, the heart chakra becomes highly activated and clean energy flows. On the other hand, in another relationship where there may be more control, criticism, or judgment, whether silent or spoken out loud, more energy moves through the solar plexus, which can be contaminating. Then all these energies that arise during the interaction do not disappear immediately. It depends, right? If, for example, it is our mother, our father, or a loved one with whom we have been interacting for many years, there are energetic connections that in that case would need to be worked on intensively through energy therapy in a truly quite advanced way, so to speak. But with people we interact with on the street or people we don't know very well, certain energetic connections are also created, but they are weaker, and today we are going to learn how to cut them. Something important beyond cutting those lighter energetic connections with a patient you have seen twice or with someone you barely know but with whom you want to cut that energetic connection is that it is important to cut it, but also to stop thinking about that person. In other words, we shouldn't remain in a state of criticism, whether by speaking badly about that person to others, thinking about them too much, or remaining very worried about them, because that generates negative energetic connections. And even if we don't do it with bad intentions, if, for example, we feel very guilty about the situation someone is in and feel a lot of pity for them, we are transmitting that energy of pity to them. They absorb it, and in reality, it doesn't benefit that person at all. Let's move on to the next slide, where I have 3 questions that will help you understand very clearly the point from which we are relating to the other person, because the way we relate to others says more about us than it does about the other person. 3 questions. Where am I relating to the other person from? Am I able to set boundaries when necessary? Am I judging the other person when they speak, or engaging in some kind of internal criticism? Because all of this means that different types of energy are being handled within that interaction. For example, I know many therapists who don't know how to set boundaries with their patients, and suddenly their patients invade their personal lives and become their friends. But obviously, when you treat a patient, that person, in some cases perhaps, but in most cases, does not have to become your friend, because that relationship is based on you helping the other person and the other person being the one receiving the help. And obviously, when that relationship starts from one person being unwell and you helping that person, if that relationship moves from the consultation room into real life, meaning into a genuine friendship, That dynamic is not going to change. You will continue to be their therapist, but in a disguised way. That's why, for example, it is very important to learn how to set those boundaries and understand that when you therapeutically help a person, first of all, it is not necessarily best for that person for you to become their friend. And secondly, that the relationship should not be based on a dynamic in which you are that person's absolute savior. There are people who are not going to understand this and will say, "No, but Lusum, you're so cold." But in reality, it is what is best for the patient, because a patient doesn't need you to be their friend. They need you to truly guide and direct them toward healing, not toward making you their savior. Does that make sense? They are two completely different things, and obviously it is very important to understand this. That's just one of many examples I could give you. People who, when they are at work and someone says to them, "Can you do this as well?" and the person has already been working for 15 hours. "Yes, yes, I can." "No." Of course, that person then feels angry, frustrated, and feels that they are being taken advantage of, but they are the one who doesn't know how to set boundaries. And this really weighs on us energetically, and it is something we have to learn to recognize both inside and outside the consultation room. How am I relating to the other person? Am I able to set boundaries? Am I judging the other person and having negative thoughts? Do I criticize them afterward when they are not there? Because all of that generates bad energy, and all of that bad energy will come back if we don't know how to manage it. Let's move on to the next point, which is unhealed internal blocks. As I was saying, those internal blocks will resonate with the patient, and we will feel bad when we experience them. It happens quite often that, for example, if a person has not healed a very large, unconscious block, they have related to sadness, abandonment, or some kind of unhealed block. As I said, whether it is sadness, guilt, anger, whatever it may be, when that person comes into energetic contact with another person who has those same blocks, it's a ticking time bomb. And if you are a therapist and there are some patients who, when you work with them, you notice that you become more energetically burdened than with others in some of those situations, not all of them, because there may also be other factors, but in some of those situations, it has to do with the fact that the patient is activating something inside you, and that activation they cause makes you feel very bad. But in reality, it is because of an unhealed internal block. It can also come from, as we said before, the place from which you are connecting with the other person, and these things are actually directly connected. Some of you may say, "But Lusum, weren't we going to talk about energetic hygiene?" The thing is, these are some of the main factors that cause a person to become energetically contaminated. Later, we're going to talk about energy techniques and so on, but if we don't know how to manage our conversations and our interactions with other people, we are going to become contaminated. If you internally hate someone when you are with them, you are not only going to become contaminated by the other person, but you are also going to become contaminated by your own hatred. Does that make sense? So energetic hygiene begins from the moment you talk to someone, from your internal state, from many things that are not worked on simply by doing the magical technique, but rather by going through a process of introspection, internal healing, and transformation. Understanding how to set boundaries, healing those blocks that remain unhealed. Because if you skip all of this and then apply the techniques, you are still going to become contaminated in certain situations. Does that make sense? That's why it is so important to have this awareness of where everything begins. So let's move on to the next point, which is the internal state in which I connect with the other person. Recently, and actually quite commonly, I receive messages from my students or from people who tell me, "Lusum, I don't know why, but I did a therapy session, and in the middle of the therapy, I became desperate. I felt frustrated. I felt nervous because it was my first therapy session, and I feel like it was a complete mess. I became very contaminated, and I feel terrible." Of course, when we work energetically without awareness, when we are more focused on our own frustration, when we do things half-heartedly, with confusion obviously, when we do this with other people, if we do it on ourselves during a process, it is different because we are working on our own energy. Now, we are talking about the other person in relation to us, right? About working on another person. This means that we end up taking on much more of their energy. Because if you are not present in your day-to-day life, whether during a therapy session or outside of it, you are going to become much more energetically contaminated. Awareness makes us much more energetically protected. Being present. If you spend 4 hours a day scrolling, your energetic state decreases, and therefore, throughout the day, you are going to become more energetically contaminated because you will be more likely to attract those energies. So let's move on to the point of energetic connections, which from my point of view is one of the most important and is applicable to any type of therapy, whether energetic or not. Basically, this point is useful because when the person goes home, we also make a commitment to let that person go, whether it is during a therapy session or with a person you interact with. Obviously, this applies if the connection you have is not a very strong friendship, a family member, or something like that, because those connections are already much stronger and much more charged. And if the relationship you have with that person is already very strong, very deep, and there is also a very significant conflict, it requires working with more advanced energetic healing techniques. This applies to lighter interactions with your patients or with interactions you may have throughout your everyday life and that you want to let go of. And basically, it consists of setting the intention. You set the intention to project any type of energetic connection that may have been generated between you and the other person. You set the intention to project those connections. And once you have projected them, with your hand as if it were a knife, you set the intention to cut any type of energetic connection that has been generated with that person. And then obviously you let go. You let go, right? As if you mentally remove them. If you start criticizing them, if you start talking about the other person, the connections will reactivate because connections are reactivated through energetic interaction, whether you are physically with the person or not. So keep this in mind, especially when talking about other people, because what you are actually doing there is also interacting energetically with those people. You connect with them, and that also brings negative consequences. So when we cut the connection, we let the person go. That will help the person, and it will also help ensure that after the therapy session, energy no longer circulates between us. So, well, I hope you have really enjoyed today's class. If you want to continue learning with me, through the link you will find in the description of this video, you can book a completely free consultation with an expert from my team who will analyze your particular situation and offer you a training plan so that you can become part of my energy therapy school, Alquimia Vital. See you in the next chapters.